Lake, October 11th, 1998. Okay, Arne. Well, how did you get started in archaeology?
I've always been in archaeology, essentially. My parents are both archaeologists, and as I grew up, every summer was an archaeological project for me out with mom and dad. Most of that work was on the coast, but that's it. Yeah.
So you went on to Simon Fraser to start with. You also went to U of T too, I suppose.
Yeah, I got my bachelor's at Simon Fraser University, my master's degree at the University of Alberta, and currently I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at University of Toronto. Hoping to finish up in about a year, finish up the dissertation.
Okay. Were you major or honors when you got your bachelor's?
A major in archaeology and a minor in physical geography, which served me well.
You did your master's on what project?
It was actually fur trade bioarchaeology, looking at some skeletal remains from fur traders from Rocky Mountain House in Alberta, central Alberta. That was a different kind of topic. We won't go into that.
Okay. So what was your experience then when you got out of school here, and what did you move on to?
Once I finished my master's, during my master's I started doing traditional archaeological research in the central interior of BC in 1993. Got a small research grant from the Circumpolar Institute in Alberta, in Edmonton, and came up here, did some survey, what have you, started finding sites, and all of this was geared towards my PhD research to come. And then ever since then, I've been up every summer, usually staying May to October, doing a variety of work, both research and cultural resource management. And it's the consulting side of things has grown almost exponentially since '93, at which time I had one small contract about 2 days, whereas this past year the entire summer has been, since May, I've had 3 crews going full-time doing consulting, and they're still out there right now.
So why did you choose the Plateau, like Nechako Plateau? How did that come about?
Well, that came about actually from some personal history, in that my parents both worked up here in the 50s with Carl Borden, so I always had a sort of connection up here. But really, my interest started in the late 80s when I was up working for Jean Bussey from Points West Heritage Consulting. Did a small job for her, and it turned out when I went to write the material up that there was no background information to work from. There was a few surveys from the 50s, a couple of very small consulting jobs, but really there was nothing known about the entire pre-contact period in archaeology of this region. So that's when my interest developed, through that lack of information, basically.
So it was wide open for you.
Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned that Carl Borden was up here. Who else? And Jean Bussey. Was there anybody else that?
Carl Borden did really the only research work up here. Farther south, Knut Fladmark, Paul Donahue, and James Helmer, sort of Blackwater River drainage, had done some research projects in the 70s. And then, but farther north, in the central interior plateau, there had been a few consulting projects, a pipeline or two Ian Wilson had been involved in, Ian Wilson also did a small survey of gravel pits in the Nechako Canyon area. And then some reviews of historical sites and historical buildings. But beyond that, there's virtually nothing.
So you really picked up a lot of work with the forest licensees. Then that's when things really got rolling for you.
Well, starting in '93 and then '94, I got actually an inventory project contract from the Forest Service in Vanderhoof to work on the Nechako Canyon, which is sort of partially motivated or from the Forest Service point of view, in terms of the land and resource management plan for the Vanderhoof district. So because they wanted to find out what the archaeological resources of that area was. From my point of view, it was perfect opportunity to do some research, survey work. So working with Craig Hooper, that's when I met Craig Hooper in '94, and he got me going on the Nechako Canyon.
So probably the primary impetus to the amount of work you've got now is probably changes in the legislation. As far as was that part of forest practices that required the licensees to?
Yeah, well, technically, Forest Service, forest industry has always, ever since the Heritage Conservation Act
What year was that?
existed in the '70s. I don't know exactly the year when it was first written. And technically, forest industries always had the responsibility to manage archaeological resources because they're protected, and they have been since the Heritage Conservation Act came in. Archaeological sites are protected. It's just that there was never the whole process of referrals and what have you, and the amount of forest industry work that there is in this province sort of precluded very much of it being done before the mid-'90s. It was with the Forest Practices Code being implemented that finally cultural heritage resources were worked into the whole process of doing logging in a formal way, because the Forest Practices Code governs everything that forest industry is supposed to do in proper management and harvest of the forest and silviculture. So having archaeology built into that certainly helped, even though the Heritage Conservation Act has applied before that and still applies. So there's two bodies of legislation really that cover archaeological sites and resources.
Okay, so then what kind of arrangement do you make with the different licensees? You, as a consultant, you just put in a bid with other consultants, or
It varies how that all works. I have a regular client base right now who, when they're setting up their development plans, etc., and doing their planning, they are required to do archaeological impact assessments on a certain number of blocks based on recommendations that the Forest Service makes, that the district manager makes. So in order to do those impact assessments, the licensees need to contract out to archaeological consultants, such as myself. And with some clients, they just call me up and say, we need these work done, so that I say okay, and I give them a cost estimate. Whereas others, the Forest Service in particular, generally puts their projects out to bid for this, for example, the Small Business Forest Enterprise Program. So they send the request for proposals or tender package to several consultants and then make their selection based on that. And yeah, that's basically how the process works.
Well, how does it work with the private companies then? Is it the same arrangement, or do they have you as a preferred consultant, or?
Well, yeah, they have, just like they have their preferred consultants for any other forestry consulting.
Yeah.
They hire a forestry consulting outfit to do their work, and only rarely does the private industry actually go out to bid, it seems, but they do
Yeah.
occasionally, but mostly it's just phone up, say, okay, well, how much is this going to cost? They often do an informal process where they phone several consultants and say, can you send me an estimate? But once you establish a client base, it's usually they just phone you up and say, this is our work for the year.
Right. Which you prefer that system rather than with the MOF?
Yeah. I think every consultant would prefer that system. Just
Yeah.
phone up and say,
Makes sense.
here's the work. It's a heck of a lot easier at the...
Right. And have they been happy with that, or?
Yeah, as far as I know.
Yeah. So you have to reach some sort of understanding with not only the district manager and the private timber company, but also the local band in the area. And how does that work out?
For me, it's always worked out fine. To do a project, any kind of archaeological project, you need to get a permit under the Heritage Conservation Act, an inspection permit, which takes about 6 weeks to get processed and issued. During part of that process, from the government's point of view, they're required to send all of these permit applications to the local bands. So that's one way where bands are involved through legislation, or not legislation, but through policy. That's the policy to do that, submit permit applications. For myself, since I've been working up here so long, I've developed a good working relationship with local bands in the area, the Tsaikas and the Nodli Wooten, Lately Tene, Chislata, and a variety of other bands. And I always talk to somebody on the phone at minimum, usually go see people, set up meetings, and hire band members. I have a regular bunch of people from the bands who help me as field assistants, depending on what traditional territory that we're working in. And all of the results and everything I forward to these bands just for their information and comments. It's a process that seems to work.
What's their perceptions of archaeological work? How do the bands perceive it, or are they?
Most of them, it depends who you're talking to, of course. If you're talking to elders, they see it as part of their history, and that these archaeology really is one of the means of investigating their history. There's a confusion that you see occasionally in bands between archaeology per se and traditional use information. Sometimes that's a bit of a problem, because for bands, traditional use and archaeological things are one and the same, whereas for archaeologists most of the time, and for legislation and what have you, archaeology is quite a different thing than traditional use information. For instance, an archaeological site has to have material remains of some past human activity, whereas traditional use doesn't have to have any material remains necessarily. It can be just an area that says this was an area, for example, where we picked berries.
So this is more dependent on oral history than actual physical evidence.
Right. Oral history, traditional use has to have like some kind of historical connection to living people in a community, or some kind of documented information about use and activities that people did in different parts of the land. Whereas archaeological remains need to, there has to be something physical at the place to show that people were there doing something.
Right. Okay, so we talked about how the local bands, how they view your kind of work. Well, what about your clients? Is it just another complication for them, more paperwork, or are they getting something out of this? Or
For the most part, it's just a complication for them, yeah. It's just another thing they have to spend money on.
are they?
I mean, it's a forest timber industry. They're out there to harvest timber. That's their purpose and their goal. And not only archaeology, but many other things, stream management, fisheries management, all of that kind of thing really are things that, in a black and white sense, get in the way of harvesting timber. But at the same time, all of these things contribute to the forest industry in that they make it a much more sustainable and minimizing impacts to the landscape and to other values that are out there beyond the simple timber values. What else could I say about that?
Do you think it's improved their understanding, the values, or the understanding or appreciation of the other values within their particular claim?
Yeah, I think on an individual level, if you're talking about a corporate level, I don't think it makes too much difference to the timber licensees. But on an individual and more personal level, in terms of the people I deal with in industry, I think, yeah, they all have realized and developed some kind of appreciation for archaeological resources, and that they are something that's real and out there that is worth documenting and managing. But of course, it varies between person, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, some people think it's great, others think, you know, they're more or less ambivalent. It's something they have to do, and they see, oh yeah, we can do it. Whereas others, you know, they're dead set against it, and they're almost forced to do it, begrudgingly. But you get the whole gamut in the industry, and it's just like, you know, it's differences in personality and what have you.
What do you think the basis of some of these attitudes are? Do you think we're still, say, as new, say, to the province of British Columbia, as far as white Europeans or people from other places are, that maybe we're still in a wilderness frontier mentality where there's these resources out here that are ready to be extracted, and there's not much that actually has happened before?
Yeah, there's some of that for sure.
Yeah.
People live in the modern world, though. I don't think people are deluded into thinking that they're living in the 1920s.
Well, what I mean is, I'm seeing is like it's an untouched wilderness here with these resources that are ready to be exploited, that have been pretty well left on their own. You know.
Up until recently, yeah. It's the one thing is that as far as the timber industry is concerned, the timber is the most important resource value. But that's what their business is all about.
Right.
So it's understandable that, you know, there is no other value for a timber industry in terms of any given block more important than the value of the timber. You know, that's natural.
Right.
But people realize that they aren't living in the old days when they can go out and do whatever they want.
I think that still persists in a lot of people's minds, especially when they're making a living, I guess, from it.
Maybe it does to a certain, but overall, I don't think that's the general.
Yeah.
At least in terms of the people I interact with in the industry.
Do you think these are Is there any people's perceptions or attitudes to archaeology? Is it perceived as still a new field that people aren't really aware of here in the West or British Columbia? Has it got a better, more readily accepted, say, across the line in the States?
Than across the line in the States?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure how it's all treated in the States in any detail. People are, in the last 4 years, have definitely learned what archaeology is. I think most of my clients 5 years ago would have said, what the heck is archaeology? But over the time since the Forest Practices Code has been being implemented, that people have learned what archaeology is and have come to accept it on some level. Whether that's there's no open-armed acceptance of it in terms of industry, but there is acceptance of it as a part of what they need to do in extracting timber. And what we've learned, although no one's compiled it yet because it's been going so fast the last few years, from archaeology in the central interior and elsewhere in the province, through all this consulting work, is going to be phenomenal once someone can put it all together. The amount of land that has been surveyed for archaeological sites in the last 5 years is huge compared to what had previously, say, been surveyed in the previous 5 years, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So, problem is compiling this information and doing interpretation of past human use of the landscape, because no one has time for that at the moment, because there's so much work needs to be done just to get the basic information from these places.
So what we're doing is accumulating a vast amount of data over the past few years, and it's just
Yeah.
has to be put together.
Yeah, someone's going to do it, and it's going to start happening more and more as in the universities. I think faculty members are going to start to realize that there's a huge data set out there that's readily accessible that wouldn't require any field work, so they can get graduate students working on a lot of this information to do more traditional academic kind of analyses of this information beyond the simple management issue of these things, of these resources as an industry.
So then, actually, it would fit in quite well with, say, the archaeology department at Simon Fraser, because they seem to be having a problem maintaining their field school, and
Well, I don't know if they've had a problem actually, but
well, what they've done is that now to get a major, I guess, one of the requirements, you're not required to go to field school, so people could actually get say like a library degree without having actually been in the field.
well, that's always been the case.
Yeah.
Field school's never been required, but
Okay.
it's this is different than field school. This is more like data that could be used for graduate honors theses, or for undergraduate honors theses, or for graduate theses. That's going to become available to people. Most of it, the kind of information, will be regional, spatial kind of settlement pattern information, or general land use in the past. Because there's very few excavations actually happening because of cultural resource management. Nevertheless, there is a lot. We're filling in gaps in the province about where sites are and what kind of sites we have.
So then we get on to these CMTs. When did this all start? When did they start occurring up here? When did you notice that they were actually a large part of the evidence up here?
Well, I've been noticing them ever since I first started working up here. But it wasn't until 95, I guess, 1995, when we encountered some blocks, logging blocks, with literally hundreds of these things in them. It was, and then ever since then, that's become more and more.
Just to maybe take it the light wasn't.
No, it's working.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, so in that late 95, we found some blocks, and at that point it was like very new to everybody working up here, and I guess I've probably had the earliest and longest experience now with them in the central interior. And over the years we've developed some fairly standardized methods of recording and managing this particular kind of resource. CMT, the most common kind up here is what we called a Cambium stripped tree. These are mostly pine trees where the bark has been removed, outer bark is removed, in order to expose the cambium layer, and people would then strip the cambium layer off in these long skinny noodles to either eat right then and there or to collect a lot and take it back for preservation or eating later on. And what you see, or what I've recognized over the years, is two basic kind of sites, and you can think of these as small sites and large sites. And functionally, small sites, small CMT sites, they're like one isolated tree, or even up to 100 culturally modified trees, but they're usually along either an established trail route, or they'll be along some kind of a natural travel corridor, like a wetland edge or a stream side of a stream or something like that, and you'll have sort of usually a linear cluster of these trees, and it's a place probably where people walked through and collected some cambium as they went. The other kind, the large sites, these can have very dense distributions, between 40 and 120 or so CMTs per hectare over large areas, and these generally seem to be occurring within 5 kilometers better, probably kilometers of these large lakes where major occupations were larger village sites, or near the now established reserves and what have you. And these huge sites I interpret as being sort of cambium resource extraction areas where people have regularly gone over the years and collected cambium to take back and to preserve. Cambium was collected in spring, usually late May to mid-June, right when the sap's just starting to flow and it's very sweet and tender. If you ever get a chance to try it, you should. It's really amazingly good at that time of year.
Is anybody still collecting it?
Mostly, I don't think anyone really collects it now as a subsistence pursuit, like as a regular thing. I hear of elders doing it as more of a teaching thing to show their kids that this is what we used to do in the past. And probably some people, if they're out in the woods at that time of year, would collect it, possibly for a snack or from food for that day. But no, I would generally, it's not a common practice. People don't need to do that. You can buy a box of sugar cubes to take with you, which serves the same, if not the same purpose, if not in a more efficient manner.
So this is not like a staple. People just didn't go out there to try and live off of cambium, pine cambium. It was just a treat on the way to somewhere else, or like a dessert supplement or something like that?
It's a sugar supplement. I mean, you can't think of it as a staple, but it's obviously something that was collected every year, okay, at that time of year for a short period of time. And it is like a treat. If you taste it yourself, yeah, it's like a treat. But it was a regular, common practice that people didn't think twice about. It's like, okay, it's cambium collecting time. Let's go and get some. But it wasn't a staple such as salmon would have been,
No,
for
okay.
instance, or anything like that.
So, yeah. So what are we getting out of CMTs? Why are they important? What does it tell us about other sites? Can it be used as an indicator for other evidence, or I mean, why? I mean, these are just this is some sort of retreat. What's it showing? What's an archaeologist learning from it?
The main thing, from an archaeological point of view, that CMTs tell you is where people were at a particular time of year in the past. If you can plot that out over the landscape, you are well on your way to defining large-scale land use patterns. So you find CMTs, you know people were there. You know what time of year they were there, and you know when exactly they were there, because you can date these things very easily. If you find at your site that it was used over and over again, then you say, oh, people regularly came here at this time of year. And then theoretically, yeah, there could be a correlation between CMT sites and other kind of sites. You could, and there already is documented between CMT sites and trail sites, which makes sense because as people traveled on these trails, they would have collected cambium. But no one's ever actually done any kind of a systematic study to try to correlate culturally modified trees with other kinds of cultural remains, which may be a worthwhile thing to do sometime. Because we're starting to get a large enough database or data set about CMTs and their spatial distribution that we could maybe do some of that.
So one of your employees is going on to graduate school and is going to be doing doing her master's on a CMT-related project.
Yeah, that's Amanda Smashnook. She just started at SFU. I'm not sure she knows exactly how she's going to approach the topic yet. I haven't talked to her now for a little while since she started this past spring. But what I think she may do is look at them from the point of view of how important cambium was or could have been to the basic subsistence practices of the carrier people. I think she may do some nutritional analyses or find some references on the nutritional value of cambium. And there are a few articles about that. And she's also going to, I think, try to do some kind of a study on how much cambium was collected physically, what volume of cambium would have been collected in these resource extraction sites, these large sites, which could give you an indication of how important it was at that time of year.
Do we know that it was stored or preserved, other than just to...
Well, we know ethnographically, from ethnographic accounts, that people both they ate it immediately and took it back and preserved it. We don't know the extent of that, however, and I'm not sure we can discover that. But if you look at a site and you figure out the volume of cambium that's collected, it may, at a certain amount of cambium, you could say that's more cambium than people would have eaten immediately. So you can make the inference that they were taking it back for storage for use later. And the other thing to keep in mind is the spring is probably one of the lowest times a year on the food cycle, the available food around. Berries haven't appeared yet. There's no salmon. Your stored salmon from the previous winters run out. Animals are pretty scraggly from the end of the winter time. All those things together probably are significant in terms of cambium, because it was a time of year when other food sources were relatively less abundant or not available at all. Hence, it may have been an important food source to tide people over for that short time until the plant and animal resources, recover after the end of winter.
So a good sugar high after the dreariness of winter.
Yeah, it's like 50% sugar or something, cambium.
Yeah. But it was used more than for a food source, wasn't it? Did you use a pine tree? Do you do other kinds of stripping the pine tree, or use other?
You don't hear about that, but yeah, spruce, pine would have, or particularly spruce, was used as the bark itself was used as a construction material for house roofing, for making small containers, baskets, and pine bark may have been used for that kind of thing too. Although the most common reference you find in the literature is to spruce bark. Pine pitch and spruce pitch would have been used for caulking boats, making holes for sealing up baskets, filling the gaps in the holes, things like that.
How about for medicine? Was there any medicinal use of?
Yeah, apparently lots of pitch and of both pine and spruce were used in many medicines. Sophie Thomas from Stony Creek could tell you much more about that than I could.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is some overlying value in CMT. So then you have your employees out there that discover, they go into a cut block and they find a patch of CMT. So what are we going to do with them? Would you recommend we're not going to save them, or we're not. I think some people think that we're out, the consultants out there, some kind of tree hugger is.
Right.
Yeah.
It varies. I mean, and the consultant does a job in order to address research values, in order to address values apparent from what the First Nations people want, and also to make sure that legislative requirements are met. And putting all that together, in most cases, doesn't mean the people can't harvest these trees. They're harvested more often than they're not harvested, than they're preserved. There's a few things. Depends on the size of site you have. Depends on the age of the CMTs that define what you need to do in order to appropriately manage this resource. Regardless of age, the first thing you need to do is document the site. Okay, you get a full documentary record involving a maps and descriptions of the trees, or a sample of them, and a sample of dates, and all of these very things. So this documents the site. That, in many cases, may be all that's necessary. If it's I should step back a little bit. Under the Heritage Conservation Act, an archaeological site is automatically protected if it's older than 1846, when the Oregon Treaty was signed. So if we date the CMTs and we find that they're older than 1846, then full documentation of the site generally requires a little bit more than if they were younger than that date, because you have to make sure that potential impacts, i.e. harvest, are fully mitigated, that we have all the information we could possibly collect from that site, or that's reasonable to collect. And really the difference between something that's pre-1846 and something that's post-1846 is, in terms of CMTs, not that significant. So you want to, regardless of age, as I said, make sure that sites are documented to mitigate impacts. In some special cases where the CMTs are on an Aboriginal trail, or if there's other archaeological resources there, like small campsites or village sites or cultural depressions or what have you, then chances are what will happen is that the trees won't be cut. The impacts will be avoided altogether. In other cases where you have just a number of CMTs, once they're fully documented, mapped, photographed, described, dated, there isn't any more information you could get from those trees. Hence, harvesting them is mitigated.
Eventually, they're going to die and fall over, or be
Anyway.
caught up in a fire anyhow.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
with most of them, what's the general age of most of them?
Well, the earliest ones I found are from the Maurice Forest District, 1795 or thereabouts, and the latest ones are as late as 1950s. The highest frequency, though, falls between about 1860 and 1930, and this is when most of the CMTs we find date to. It's not so much a factor of changing use of importance of cambium harvest. That's really a factor of forest succession, in that once you get to trees that are older than 1860, you have fewer and fewer stands that are that age. And once you get past 240 years, pine trees generally have died and fallen. A pine older than 240 years is pretty rare. However, the 1930 date, the 30s date for the end of this, I think is actually real and reflects the time when cambium basically declined as collecting cambium declined as a usual common practice in the Aboriginal communities. And this correlates well with the full establishment of reserve life, the full establishment of our modern transportation system for supplying goods and what have you across the province. And it was no longer necessary to collect cambium in the spring anymore, because you had sugar and flour and tea and all of your other necessities arriving that you could buy. So I think the ending date there we see in the frequency is like the 30s, when the frequency declines significantly, is real, whereas the decline at the other end before the 1860s is simply a factor of forest succession and fires and what have you.
You won't find many pine trees generally over 100 years old or so, or 150 years.
Well, they live to 200, 240 years. Once you get older than 180 years, those kind of stands get very infrequent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we've got actually quite a significant site was found over in the Morrison district there.
Northeast of Babine Lake, just northeast. That site there was discovered through an impact assessment of a Houston Forest Products cutting permit. And the crews went in there and found CMTs all over. And that was last year, 97, when that site was first found. And basically it was determined there are CMTs throughout this whole area, the whole cutting permit, and beyond, to some unknown extent. It's never been found out yet. But this is one of these large sites I was talking about, and there's other examples of these sites, but this is probably one that's had the most work ever done on it, that represents a cambium harvest area that was regularly revisited over the year by people living on Babine Lake, both probably at Fort Babine and at Old Fort, and the other reserves on that north arm of Babine Lake. The number of CMTs in there, they're old CMTs. They range between 1790s and the 1850s. That's their general age range. The density of the site is somewhere around 40 CMTs per hectare. Many of them are multiply scarred, so they were stripped over different years for cambium, the same tree, and they're in total, it's only can have some fairly rough estimates, but somewhere around 18,000 trees or CMTs are probably represented at that site as a whole. The numbers that are going to be impacted by the cutting permit, if it gets approved, is probably 15% of that or so, maybe 10% of that, which would be about 1,800.
So the site
2,000.
extends far beyond a cutting permit?
Yeah, in all directions, as far as we know. Like I say, it's such a large area that trying to actually define the limits of this distribution would be quite the job. So work we've done in that cutting permit this year was geared towards mitigating harvest of the CMTs that are going to be impacted. And this involved a systematic sampling strategy in order to document the density distribution of trees within the cutting permit and to get a representative sample of dates from the trees and a representative sample of photographs and descriptive information about the trees, all of which effectively mitigates the impacts of these CMTs in the cutting permit. Hence they can harvest once they get their cutting permit. Yes, so all this mitigates the impacts to the trees in the cutting permit. And in the sampling strategy provides representative data for that represents the site as a whole, but also advantageously is that the site is so much larger than the cutting permit, which means there's examples of these trees still standing could be used and viewed by people who are interested and what have you, or if they want to collect other information that wasn't collected from the trees in the cutting permit. The problem is, ultimately, however, is that regardless, this stand of pine and CMTs is going to be gone because it's such an old stand within 30 to 50 years anyway, and even probably before that, because we're talking about trees that are getting close to 220, 240 years old for the most part. So they're at the end of their life anyway.
It's quite amazing to think that here we have some actual material evidence that's still alive going back this far. Because usually an archaeologist is going to find mostly stone material, static. This is
still in the works, living. The activity is represented by the scar, though. The tree is really just the vehicle by which the scar maintains itself. Luckily for us, if this practice killed the trees, these would not be visible to us today. And that's something I didn't mention earlier, but stripping cambium doesn't kill the tree because they weren't girdled. It was only one side of the tree or a third of the trunk that was stripped. So half the tree is killed or a third of the tree is killed, but the rest of the tree keeps growing, and the scars, in fact, slowly heal, and the tree is perfectly successful. It doesn't seem to affect the viability of these pine growing at all. Yes, so the practice, we have evidence of this practice going back to the 1790s, which, as you know, is when Mackenzie came through here. So it's clear that this was a practice that was has a long history. I mean, before contact, people were stripping cambium, and for 100 years after contact or more, people were still stripping cambium. So this is one of the interesting things about CMTs, is that it crosses the whole boundary between pre-contact and contact period Aboriginal culture and traditional practices, and we can still find evidence for it today. It's something that's continuous up until, as I said, about the 30s, and this is why they become important for the Aboriginals, because they document not only that people were at a place at a particular time of year, but they represent a traditional practice that has a long history and represents a part of the Aboriginal way of life.
In a sense, then, that they would I think a lot of First Nations have had the problem that history started with, the arrivals of Europeans in the beginning of written records, and this sort of cuts through and almost fuses, say, prehistory to history.
Yeah, that's right, it does. I mean, archaeologists have always known that history didn't start with the arrival of Europeans. But there's a lot of other people in the country that generally don't think about it. It's not that they refuse to admit it, they just don't think about it. The fact that people have lived here for 10,000 years and that there's a much longer history of people and ways of life beyond the European history in the New World.
Let's take a look at the political aspects of this, because there was a problem over there at Morrison where I guess the archaeologists, your company got there a little late, and then it was discovered that it was a pre-1846 site, and it was basically a stop work was put on that site when it had been that particular logging contract been looking at that block as part of its winter cut. It's how do you deal with those problems, or
well, for me, it's not a problem at all. It is for that
well,
contract.
for somebody that's been put out a 2 or 3 weeks work of work, it's they just look. I mean, to put it in the vernacular, they just look begin to start to look as archaeologists as another pain in the ass brought in along with the Forest Practices Code.
And to a degree, yeah, they do look at it that way. But rather than look at it that way, for me, I look at it more as we've found this site. It's a site that the Houston Forest Products or whatever logging company is required to manage. There's 2 bodies of legislation that are telling Houston Forest Products to manage this resource, and my job is to facilitate the whole process so that Houston Forest Products can harvest that wood. If we didn't do any of this work, Houston Forest Products wouldn't be able to harvest this wood at all. And it's not because of the archaeologists that work is delayed. It's because there's a resource there that has to be managed. Okay, and the archaeologist's job is to document it and to record it such that impacts and harvest to that site are mitigated. And yes, because the resource is there are delays in harvesting. That can't be avoided. There's no way to avoid those kind of delays. But if we found the site and that was it, then that logging contractor is forever out of work at that site. However, we go and do more work there, and then even though the contractor loses his 2 weeks of work right now, he'll get that 2 weeks of work next spring or next summer. It's not gone forever, it's just that there's a delay. And I'm sure, I don't know positively, but I feel sure that this contractor probably was sent off during those 2 weeks to go harvest somewhere else. Hence, I mean, it wasn't lost.
Oh, I got that different.
Different point of view?
Well, I didn't really delve into it too much there at the time, but
Yeah.
they got shut down. I guess I'm not sure what the whole process would happen there.
Yeah, and it's because the resource is there. But they'll be back,
Yeah.
virtually certain. The where it stands now is we've done this whole sampling survey. Impacts to the from an archaeological point of view, from the value of this resource, have been mitigated. So my recommendations at this stage are that they can go harvest. They have permits in place under the Heritage Conservation Act that allows them to harvest. The other realm of this, however, is that under the Ministry of Forests Protection of Aboriginal Rights policy, before they can issue the cutting permit, the Ministry of Forests has to ensure that informed consultation has occurred between the First Nations Forest Service and the logging company, and they also have to make sure and evaluate whether Aboriginal rights are being violated, if they are, whether they're justifiable, and if they're justifiable, whether there are other ways to address the Aboriginal rights. And so that's where this cutting permit is now. It's the archaeology part is over and done with. It's now in the realm of consultation and Aboriginal rights before the Forest Service can sign off on the cutting permit to get harvesting. Are we done?
Yeah. Okay. So overall, let's just wrap this up then. What with all your work here on the plateau, what have you found as like? Has there been anything surprised you, overwhelmed you with your work here? Is there anything startlingly different in the archaeology or the CMT work than somewhere else, or were you surprised by anything? Or
well, just in the central interior, which is sort of the transition zone between the boreal forest and the southern intermontane forest and grasslands, we seem to have this area that's a transitional resource zone between, and an overlap between simple and common forest resources and Pacific salmon drainage resources. So we have this kind of ecotone kind of environment, and I think that is partly why there's so many culturally modified trees in this part of the province. You don't find nearly this density farther south in the interior, and you don't find nearly this density farther north in the interior. So there's something about this area, and it's the nature of the forest, the amount of pine probably has something to do with it, that made cambium a more important resource than elsewhere in the province. So that was surprising and interesting, just the sheer magnitude and volume of this single subsistence practice. The other things, that's in terms of CMTs. On the coast, you have lots of CMTs, but they're different kinds of CMTs. They're more of a raw material extraction for birch bark, wood, canoe trees, etc. So it's not a subsistence resource; it's a raw material resource.
construction.
Yeah. not getting away from CMTs, the other thing, the survey on the Nechako Canyon and subsequent work we've done there demonstrates a very intensive and probably long-standing occupation of the Nechako Canyon. This is the area just below Kenny Dam, where the canyon is now dry. But there are many, many sites on the canyon. There's upwards of 150 sites on this short stretch of river, 30% of which are habitation sites, small village sites. And what's surprising there, not so much that there are sites there, which we would expect, but that there are so many, and that there's literally no ethnographic documentation or information, oral histories, anything about any kind of Aboriginal use of that area. There's a few legends, there's a few sources that document trails that went through there and what have you, but there's really no ethnographic documentation of village sites and habitation, and that it was obviously a place where people went all the time, and there would have been a substantial population there. So that was surprising.
What kind of information? What did the information seem to indicate that you extracted from along the canyon? Could you make any sort of inferences from what you learned there, or why this?
Well, it seemed like the key question here that one of my crew members brought up yet again a few weeks ago was whether or not salmon were able to get through the canyon. The salmon weren't able to get up the Cheslata River to Cheslata Lake, and we can document that through inference in that all the Cheslata peoples regularly in the summer went up to Fraser Lake to get salmon. So we know they didn't go up farther than Cheslata Falls, but we don't know if they went up into what is now the reservoir and spawned. It would seem that there was a large amount of salmon that went at least to the mouth of the canyon because of the number of village sites right there in that area, the number of cache pits, which indicate probably salmon storage, and then up and down the canyon itself there are many sites with many cache pits for food storage. And so all of these things tend to suggest that salmon were getting to and into the canyon. But of course, with the flooding of the reservoir, we don't know if they went beyond that, and I can't find any documentation that they did go beyond the canyon. The rivers would have been suitable. You do find descriptions of beautiful gravel beds and shallow rivers in that system up there that's now reservoir. But again, it's one of these questions that probably is going to remain unanswered. There doesn't appear to have been any study done on the effects of Camano 1 construction of Kenny Dam on salmon in the upper Nechako above the canyon. But that was in the 1950s, so it's not that surprising there wasn't any kind of study like that. And then now the modern run of Chinook that goes beyond the Notley River up the upper Nechako is so small compared to what it must have been when people were living there that something else has happened since people lived there. You know, since 1500 years ago, at some point in there, it seems like the salmon must have died off, or the runs must have become substantially smaller sometime after 1500 or 1000 years ago anyway. And hence the area was abandoned maybe by people who then focused their energies on harvesting salmon at Fraser Lake and in the lower Nechako, in the Nechako Valley area.
That couldn't by any chance have been another something else that happened to be around that area that brought that concentration, say another resource, say like caribou, or happened to be frequent that area. Did you get any faunal samples from?
Yeah, we got some faunal, but we haven't had it analyzed. And most faunal you get is so broken up you can't identify it anyway. But there is a possibility, yeah, because there are caribou herds, woodland caribou, still farther south, the Antioco area. And before moose arrived in this area, there was probably much more caribou than there is today. But it doesn't seem right that just doesn't seem to fit that it would have been a caribou, like a land-based resource that made people come and live on this
Right on the
canyon.
river bench, yeah. Yeah.
So that just doesn't make sense. But there is a possibility that there was some other reason, yes. But salmon seems to be the logical one. So anyway, I think we're done.
Okay, that was great.
I'm tired of talking.
Yeah, okay, that was great.
Yeah.